Hello and welcome to today's episode of the People's Partnership Podcast, better known as PPP, which is the perfect name for today's discussion. We're talking about public-private partnerships, better known again as PPPs. And today we're not just talking about infrastructure, we're talking about community engagement. Help me welcome today's guests.
My name is Johnson Kilangi. I'm the CEO at Miundo Misingi Hub. I'm an infrastructure project finance and public-private partnership expert. And what I do is I offer advisory in the infrastructure project finance and PPP space across Africa. I equally build capacity of professionals across Africa. We run the longest running action-based training program on project finance and PPP, whereby we identify and build the next leaders in the infrastructure space by bringing, consultants from across the globe to share the nuggets and lessons that they've gathered in their role across the world in making sure that we can curate solutions for Africa, solutions that can work in the infrastructure space.
My name is Titus Kuria. I am a community engagement specialist. I'm currently a program manager at Forum Civ. And Forum Civ is a civil society organization that works to enable development, and that is through implementing or supporting projects that are community-centered, largely around human rights, democracy, and good governance. And for the last 6 years, we have been developing a model of how the civil society, the private sector, and the public sector can work together to champion inclusive growth within underdeveloped communities in Kenya, but largely in Eastern and Southern Africa.
My name is Jackson Obari. I'm the regional manager for Forum Civ, based here in Nairobi, and we are very happy and excited to have all of you here for this discussion today.
So I'd just like to start us off by a basic introduction for people who do not know what PPP is about. How would you describe PPP?
PPP is basically an effective collaboration between the private sector and public sector. And this collaboration is basically aimed at helping government deliver on public functions by engaging the private sector. I think the emphasis here is on effective collaboration so as to ultimately deliver a good service to the public.
Titus, what is community engagement and why is it important?
So community engagement is how basically you work with people to ensure that they participate effectively in making decisions that define their development. And this is largely anchored under key principles of a human rights-based approach to development that recognizes that people have the right to participate, they have the right to decide what is important for them. And therefore, when you're working with PPPs, then we see it as very, very important to ensure that you allow the people to give in their views, put in suggestions, and where possible to actually enable them own some of these processes, including possibly managing some of the processes so that then they're able to sustain those initiatives once done.
Why do PPPs matter to Kenya's development?
Let's start from why we are building projects. Projects are basically technical solutions that are put together to effectively address the needs, of the society or the community where we live in. So starting from that point, it's very important that we identify good projects so that ultimately we meet the needs of the people. Now, projects require investments, require resources. And when you look at the time we are in as a country and as a continent, the governments are facing a challenge because there is no sufficient public finance headroom to be able to meet all these expanding needs of the community. And so that's why it becomes very important for government to work out and engage the private sector so that the private sector can provide the much needed resources and equally the expertise to be able to design and build these projects so that ultimately those projects benefit the people. So where we are and going forward, it will become very important that we create effective PPPs, public-private collaborations, so that then we can be able to meet these growing needs of the society. And it's very critical that we forge an effective collaboration, partnership, that ultimately then benefits the people.
For the ordinary Kenyan, could you please give us an example of some of the PPP partnership projects that have been successful, both in Kenya and around Africa? Yeah.
So I think for the common listener, I think it's important to speak a language they understand. So PPP is basically private sector coming in to deliver an asset or service that is in the scope or role or responsibility of government. And I want to use an example that is known to many Kenyans because it's among the first PPP projects that we have in the country, the famous Nairobi Expressway, whereby a private sector investor came in to build a road project on behalf of government and then generate revenues and collect money and recover the investment out of the collections they make from the project. So that's a very good example in the transport sector. However, PPPs can also be used in different sectors. So when you look at housing, for example, the Kenya Defense Forces, for example, have built quite a number of houses for the military personnel by working with the private sector. So another good example in the real estate space. We have the Galana Kulalu project that is currently under construction in the agricultural space. So again, trying to see how can private sector come in, bring the investment and bring the expertise to be able to grow food for Kenyans. That's also a good example of PPPs. But it's important to also mention that PPP is a new model, especially in the African space. We are talking of about 10 years or so of existence in the African space. So we also have the Galana Kulalu project, which is an agricultural-based PPP project whereby the private sector is coming in to bring in the investment and the expertise to be able to grow maize and other products using a PPP arrangement. So we have quite a number of PPP projects, some at different levels of implementation. And I think that's a conversation we'll have also to understand the cycle. There's a whole process that goes behind the scenes before we see a project coming to fruition.
PPP projects in Kenya have faced community resistance. What are the recurring issues behind such challenges?
Well, I think when Johnson mentioned about PPPs and largely the lack of understanding among key actors within the sector and development of these projects and throughout the cycle has actually contributed largely to resistance of these projects. If you look into history, you'll actually find some projects that were private sector led, not necessarily structured as PPPs, but then they had a private sector interest in that. And why, from our perspective, leads to resistance, and sometimes even some of the projects have ended up being closed, and hence a lot of money getting lost, a lot of taxpayers' money perhaps getting lost in that process. Because then if the communities, because these projects are building communities, do not understand exactly what problems these projects are coming to solve. So they see them as foreign projects, as other people's ideas who are being enforced on them. So I think if you look back at the cycle that Johnson looked or mentioned, there actually exists opportunities where communities can be engaged to better understand what the project is about, to also understand what problem is it coming to solve, and lastly, and most importantly, is what is their role in these projects. A lot of the time, you see or you hear debates on social media about projects happening that people don't understand. And this country is not short of histories of projects that have come to face on social media and ended up causing a big upheaval in this country. And that's basically because of lack of structured engagement of communities. And communities can take all manner of shapes. But then, why do we think community engagement is important? Along that cycle, whether it is during, largely after the PPP projects have reached financial close and now they get to be executed, they will require skills. For example, if you take an example of the Nairobi Expressway, who is doing the construction? Where are those materials going to be sourced from? Where are those well leaves? Where are those drainage, for example, of the water going to happen? And these people affect people's lives every day. We've seen people again coming out, I think, on social media seems to be our go-to place to put out our complaints on the effects of what has happened up there with the expressway to what is happening. And I remember at one point, the entity that was responsible had to come out and actually say what is going to happen after that. So I think for me, engaging people is ensuring that they understand that process. They also understand who is financing it, and that can really solve a lot of problems. Again, as earlier mentioned, with the misunderstanding on what is a PPP project. And I think if community engagement is done in the right way, it actually creates a win-win situation for both private sector, because again, remember that the government has the principal duty of providing services. So it's only delegating this role to a private sector, and this can be for many reasons, whether they don't have the financing at that time, whether they do not have the mechanisms and the efficiency to run such kind of enterprises. So I think it's very, very important that governments then leads a role in ensuring that they engage people. And it's not just for the sake of doing it. I mean, how do you remain accountable to people if they do not know what is happening behind the scenes? And I think we are at an age and time where if people don't have information, they will ask for that information.
So unlocking domestic capital, these are some of the strategies. They need to approach development in a multi-sectoral manner and understand communities must play an integral role and take the center stage that will ensure sustainability. I think some key words that have been mentioned throughout the whole day, sustainability of projects, so that when you have donors, when you have the government leaving the stage, what happens as much as there's M&E happening throughout, that community is able to sustain that project that has been started off by the different players.
There's a project that came to mind as you were speaking, the nuclear power plant. I'm not sure, maybe you can clarify if that's also a PPP, but it faced a lot of resistance. It was on the coast, faced resistance. Then now they're trying to set it up somewhere in the Western region. That kind of resistance came because a lot of the people did not understand what a nuclear power plant is doing in the middle of Kenya and why it's there anyway. They thought the government is here to try and kill our people, to finish us. You're bringing poison around our area. And that is quite an interesting debate. Even internally, when we talk about that project, it's usually very interesting for us. Anyway, going back to the topic, do you have some really good examples of PPPs that have benefited the community?
I may not have a very good grounding of particular PPPs that have been, and especially greenfield projects that are invested in communities compared to the Nairobi Expressway, for example. But what I can share is what we believe and think is the best way to engage communities. And we have, for the last 6-7 years, have been working on how PPPs can actually bring in development in it. And as we call it now, is public-private development partnerships. If you visit, for example, one of the areas where we've had huge private sector-led investments, or whether with government backing, is within the geothermal development area in Olkaria, in Naivasha. And if you go to that community, you'll actually get to see a snippet of how the community relates with whoever the investor is, whether it is private sector-led or the public sector. So what we think is quite important is early engagement, that you need to engage people very early into the process, help them understand exactly what I mentioned earlier, that this is a project we are bringing on board, this is how it's going to solve your problems, and this is how you're going to benefit of it. Secondly, how do you ensure that the ecosystem around that investment also benefits? And this includes skills development, for example. Some of the things we are talking about are highly technical projects that require certain skills which are not provided for within either the local vocational training centers or the TVETs around that area. So part of it, and this is connected highly to the resistance as we spoke about, because then again, if communities see people from other areas are the majority of people working there, they will resist because they need to benefit economically from that. And so if private sector understands from the onset what are the skills challenged within that area, then they can work with the local vocational training centers, for example, to create skills so that when these projects start being implemented, they can lead to employment of young people within the community. Remember that, of course, we have a huge challenge with employment of young people in this country. So I see ensuring that private sector understands the ecosystem within which it is operating in and working with government to solve some of those challenges early enough as a good pathway to ensuring that there's sustainability, but there's also ownership by the communities that we work.
It's important to emphasize that community engagement that does not just happen in specific, processes in the cycle of a PPP project. It has to start from the conceptualization phase and be implemented all the way until the project is decommissioned. So that means engaging the community and the people and the stakeholders at all the stages. And at each of these stages, you're packaging specific content that is supposed to be channeled to the community. And equally, you need to create a platform that allows also the community to communicate back so that you have feedback. And using that feedback, then you can realign where necessary to make sure that the project continues to deliver on what it was intended. Now, coming to whether the project has achieved that requirement of community engagement is something that needs to be defined as you're doing the feasibility studies and structuring the project. We need to have developed a community engagement framework with clear metrics as to how we are going to measure how we engage the community. Now, on the basis of that framework and the output indicators that we've designed, then we can now audit and monitor and say we have delivered in terms of community engagement. If that is not in place, it becomes difficult for us to say that this project has achieved, that community engagement and empowerment requirement. So I think that's very important, and this is a responsibility that must be driven by government as the owners of the project, so that it's very clear, and we can make sure that we align the requirements of the project on the side of the private sector, so as to make sure that the private sector delivers on that important requirement.
It has led to the collapse of sometimes very well designed and well intended projects. But I think it's also important to also put it in the shoes of the community, because it's one thing for us to say we have delivered the metrics, but it's also the other for community to say we actually feel the impact of the projects that we are doing with this. So I think finding that balance, and of course, if you speak to private sector, largely where Johnson interacts with, one of the key challenges is this thing takes time. We don't have the money to do that. But I think this is where civil society, of course, we have come in strongly, because we think it doesn't matter how long it takes. And you can be as quick as possible to deliver a project within time and meet all the requirements. But then during your operations, the communities start protesting. So you have to shut down your operations, and you have debts to pay in whatever form and nature. So remember, you are so quick to deliver the project and bypassed the role of communities in it. But once they start resisting the project, we have seen instances where they have actually destroyed critical infrastructure that is meant to support the delivery of this project. So I think this topic on how we engage communities, irrespective of the risk, and as we talk about who de-risks that period or whatever resources are used for that community engagement, I think for me it's very, very important that for all the players to understand what it means and then why it's important to think of a win-win situation from the onset.
Are there projects that have completely stalled because of lack of community engagement?
Just do a basic search. One popular project that will come up is called the Kinangop Wind Farm project, a very ambitious project that was supposed to utilize wind to develop power just in Kinangop on your way to Naivasha. And it's very important to mention why having the right information at the right time and targeted to the right people, because then it kills the room for propaganda. So that project, I can't remember the figures, but it was close to, I think, 15 billion Kenya shillings was projected to be what was spent. They had gone all the way to actually having a power purchase agreement with the off-taker of the power. But then, due to those loopholes, propaganda emerged on what were the effects of the wind turbines. There were all manner of propaganda that came up, including how the communities there are no longer going to have children. A lot of very emotional propaganda that then made the community resist that project. So the history is there and it's documented how the project actually went to litigation here and abroad because of the investors that were involved. And eventually, of course, the money was lost. And not just the money in this case, but it's also thinking how we lost the opportunity to develop this country and develop infrastructure, because energy is a critical aspect of development. So those are some of the one of the projects that for me I have always looked back at as a case study of how not to do community engagement.
Now let's talk about policy. Kenya has the PPP Act of 2021. Does this act adequately provide structured and mandatory community engagement?
Yeah, so I mentioned about the PPP Act. We have the improved version, the PPP Act of 2021, which repealed the previous act. And it provides a framework as to how community can be engaged. So, for example, it mentions that the contracting authorities, which are actually the government agencies implementing these projects, have the responsibility to engage the community. It even speaks to the cabinet secretary will prescribe frameworks as to how the community will be engaged. The only challenge we have currently is that we do not have the corresponding regulations to operationalize the PPP Act of 2021. And ideally, the regulations will provide more weight as to how this will be done. Fortunately, I know the PPP Directorate of Kenya, that is under the National Treasury, is currently working to finalize the regulations so that it can provide more clarity as to how this will be done. Now, as to the adequacy, that's something that is subjective. I think contracting authorities can do more, and of course working with the private sector, because the more you engage the community, the better for the project, because you're trying to effectively manage some risks which could potentially impact negatively on the project. So the more we do it, the better. I think going forward, what needs to be done is to provide more clarity as to what is adequate in terms of community engagement. How can we provide metrics to measure community engagement? And this is not something we can just leave to government. And that's why I started by talking about effective collaboration between public and the private. We equally have a role to play as private, as the public, as the community. It's actually not easy to manage communities, especially where, there is a project and we know in the Kenyan context what happens. So this is something that has to involve everybody. And government has to create that ecosystem that allows every player to chip in and make sure that we are building a conducive environment that allows for more community engagements in this project. So I think just to summarize, The regulations will provide more light as to whether what we are doing in terms of community engagement is adequate. But I think I'll challenge both government and private sector to do more, because ultimately it's to the benefit of the project and, of course, the people.
Johnson has talked about the regulations. I want to throw a question back at you. If you're to change something or amend the PPP Act of 2021, what's the most urgent thing?
Local content sharing. And I think we know, or we have ideas across Africa. And as Johnson mentioned at the beginning, we are only probably 10, 15 years into implementation of PPPs. But actually, there are countries in Africa who are ahead of us in implementing PPPs. And I think South Africa is one of those. And they had a model that was called the REIPP, which is the Renewable Energy Independent Public Procurement, that actually created a provision of the percentage that communities were going to benefit from that procurement. I think that is something that we are lucky in this act. And this leaves communities at the mercy of private sector or government to decide. And I think what we have seen, again, from a civil society lens is Johnson and I will sit in a very cozy hotel in Nairobi and decide that what is important for a community in Turkana or in Taita Taveta is actually a toilet, or it's a school. I mean, those are important infrastructure and facility. But I think to add dignity, it will be very, very important to also ensure that you bring in the voice of these actors, what really works for you. And I think if we were to change something about it, is actually defining slightly better and creating caveats for allowing a local content sharing. Maybe not a percentage, but at least a guideline on how that is going to be executed, but with strong prominence on ensuring that you consult and you engage those communities on what is very, very, very important for them.
Private sector are coming to work with government, not just because they love the people. They are looking for a good return. Absolutely. A return that is better than what the market is offering. So I think if we're able to attach a financial incentive to projects that have gone an extra mile, to engage the community, and it's not just engagement, to also empower, because you're not just engaging. We need to go an extra mile and make sure that the project effectively, addresses the needs of the people. Now, we talk about sustainability, which is one of the initiatives we drive at the Miundo Misingi Hub in infrastructure projects. And when you look at community engagement and empowerment, it's actually a subset of sustainability. So we need to make sure that we are building an ecosystem in the financial sector that, remedies, either government, private sector, or both, those that have gone an extra mile to empower the communities. And this can be done by making sure that projects that have that sustainability element driven by community engagement then are able to tap financial solutions at better terms and conditions. So if I demonstrate that I've done X, Y, Z in terms of engaging the community and empowering them, I can get my loan to pump into a project perhaps at 2% lower than the market rate. And then government must make sure that the output indicators that will be used to measure the performance of the private sector are actually aligned towards community engagement. That's an easy and effective way to make sure that we are aligning the goals of government and also the private sector. And ultimately, it is the community that will benefit, because the private sector will be inclined towards engaging the community more, improving the lives of the community, because they know through that way, then they can get optimal returns of the project, because government has structured the project in that arrangement. So I think that's one of the most effective way to do that, and ultimately everybody benefits out of that particular project.
First of all, of course, we appreciate that we have the legal framework in place. It is very, very important, and I think we could be further ahead than our counterparts in the region, I believe. And as always, we are trailblazing in that area. But then, even as we think of incentives and then how to overcome these challenges on resistance, one of the other things we are facing is documentation. Johnson mentioned about private sector who are going an extra mile to do good. And I think he mentioned something that they are not in it to do good to people, they are in it to make money. But remember, if information is not packaged in the right way, there's always this assumption that private sector is making a kill out of it, which is not a reality. If you look at it, first of all, they are taking a risk. They are investing their money. And sometimes this money is sourced from international markets or from wherever. So if communities actually are able to understand that private sector involvement is not, they're not making a kill of profit out of it, because there's a misunderstanding that these are the most profitable things you can get into. So I think that's quite important. Then secondly, the issue you mentioned about where we can get financing from. I think in the international market, there are actually available resources for private sector who go out of their way to empower, whether do sustainable projects that are green. All those things are available in the international market. And therefore, as we stick to the point on what do we need to do, is create a regulatory framework that actually allows those indicators to be incorporated, so that then even the private sector that is seeking to develop these projects can access funding from the international market.
We've talked about organizations making a kill. Now let's talk about the communities. How can PPP frameworks integrate local employment quotas, revenue sharing models, and also support for small businesses within the project areas?
I think that we should have introduced this at the beginning, but it's important to understand that there are two models of PPP in terms of procurement. And the first one is where government will originate the project, package it, and take it to the market. So what we call the solicited PPPs, right? And we also have another option whereby the private sector can scan the market and identify opportunity and then put together a proposal and present it to government for evaluation. So this second one is what we call a privately initiated PPP project, what we call PAP, right? And ultimately it will go through the same process and then the private party will be accepted to, invest in the project. I think the Nairobi Expressway is one good example of a PAP sort of procured project. So for all these projects, government has a say as to how ultimately it will be structured. But of course, there will be negotiations with the private sector as to how ultimately that project will look like. And because government has that control, it can shape what it requires in terms of engaging the community, in terms of local content, in terms of, the empowerment that it wants to be seen out of the project. And of course, there's all the legal anchorage around that, because the PPP law will also prescribe what is required in terms of local content and public participation and engagement. So if that is properly structured, because we also don't want to make it very difficult for the private sector to make a return because of all these requirements we are putting on the private sector. So it has to be structured very well so as to make sure that ultimately it benefits both parties. Because every time you put stringent requirements on the private sector, remember that it comes at a cost. And that cost ultimately dilutes the ultimate return that the private sector will make out of the project. So when you're doing the structuring, we need to package it in a way that ultimately benefits the community. And so you come up with indicators. For example, I want 40% of the jobs to target local community. And that is an output requirement. And so the private sector is required to make sure that is achieved. But let's do it, carefully so as to not make it easier for the private sector to implement the project. So I think that's the way that government can approach that, just to make sure that ultimately the project benefits the community.
Johnson talked about jobs. How do we create jobs? We know that at a certain phase of development of each project, certain jobs will be required. So if we really want to empower communities, and then I really like the idea of incentivizing private sector that is going out of their way to create an empowerment framework. This cannot be an afterthought. So as we are developing the financing models, as we are coming up with the incentive packages, it has to be very clear. You require this number of engineers. Where are they going to come from? Because it's one thing to have that on paper in the contracts and all that, but then going an extra mile to actually ensure that those engineers come from either whatever kind of community, because again, community here is not a one suit fits all. A community for the expressway could be very different for community for Talo or in Turkana. Completely different. So again, it's very, very, very important to go beyond the general provisions and come up with clear ways of how are we going to ensure that these jobs are created. And I think in the last 6 years, again, we have demonstrated this is important. Do a skills matching survey. Understand what jobs are what skills are available within the immediate market. What can we do? And I think this is beyond what is provided by the law. It's actually the private sector entity going out of their way and asking themselves, what can we do to create this change? And of course, working with government. And what we have demonstrated, for instance, is if you upskill instructors within the local vocational training centers to understand what skills demand you will have, then it becomes much easier for them to actually teach based on a directed sort of a job market, rather than just skilling people with the hope that there will be a job. But if we know, for instance, the Mau Summit road is going to be expanded, as of now, we should be preparing the communities across that corridor on what will be required, from the basic skills to the high-level technical skills. And so in 2-3 years, when that road is now under construction, then the communities can actually see their role in it, contribute to it, ownership. And I must mention that if people are rightly involved, some of the things we see, including people damaging critical infrastructure, would not happen, because they will say, no, this belongs to us. We had a role to play in this. It's not someone else's project.
You work very closely with communities. What are they asking for?
One, I think it's very important to appreciate that it's giving space and working with methods that communities speak out. From what we have seen and why we think development should go hand in hand with private public projects is because we are still struggling in some communities with basic facilities, healthcare, for example. Water access is still a challenge to these communities, access to vocational education. Of course, we have other soft issues related to, for example, gender equality. And it may not be the interest of private sector, for instance, to intervene around creating gender equality. But then if we have an incentive that allows them to actually measure and show how many women and girls have you employed, at what level have they been employed, then that contributes to the larger agenda. So I think having a conversation around that is very, very important. But what we see is that in especially greenfield projects, communities around that area are still struggling with basic infrastructure. We did a study with one of the universities here, and one of the things we established, for instance, in Olkaria, which was our case study, is close to $1 trillion have been invested in that area, I think, for the last 20 or 25 years. But then my assumption, or anybody's assumption, is $1 trillion is something that should be felt by the local communities. It's a very stark contrast when you go to the same communities and you still find that they are still struggling to access water. They're still struggling to access education. Their road infrastructure is still poor. Maybe we can do a little bit more to ensure that whatever amount of money is invested at whatever costs is still felt within at least the most immediate communities within that area.
I have mentioned that we bring the private sector into these projects because of two reasons. One is the resources, they bring the capital, the investment required to build these projects. And the second one is they bring the expertise to design, build, and operate these projects. Now, when you talk about the expertise, and we come here, we have a requirement from government or the community saying you must employ 40% of the total workforce from the community. Remember, the private sector party wants to bring efficiency. It needs a certain skill so as to deliver that project effectively, so as to increase the return of that particular project. So we must be, open to a conversation that allows the private sector also to bring in certain components of the workforce that it requires to effectively deliver on that particular project. So it's not an easy conversation because in PPP we say we cannot prescribe inputs to the private sector partner. What we need to do is to prescribe outputs, right? But making sure that these outputs are built and driven alongside, the requirements of the law in terms of community engagement and empowerment. So it's a thin balance, and that's why we've said it's supposed to be a collaborative effort by government and the private sector. If private sector is not making a good return because we've made it difficult because of our demands in terms of community empowerment, it means that project will not attract good investors, good lenders, and that project will not take off because there is no financing. If there is no sustainable finance for that particular project, that project will not take off and will not have a project, and the community will not benefit. So you see how difficult it is to strike a balance, among these different divergent, interests of community, government, and the private sector.
I think that's why, as a civil society organization, we put our skin in that game of managing PPP. Because as Johnson mentioned, if things are left to run naturally, then sometimes it can be very difficult for all of us. The communities will not benefit, the project will not be done, and therefore there will not be development. But then how do we create a platform for a conversation? And part of the reason why we are actually on the forefront to kickstart conversations like this is because we want to ensure that everybody has the right information. As I've said in this conversation before, there is an illusion that PPPs are a cash cow, and so people are making a lot of money, which may not be the case. So I believe this is part of the start of the conversation because I think we've not had enough conversations on what PPPs are, who benefits, who does what, how are they arrived at, and therefore people are still very skeptical about this. And then we have seen some of the projects, including what was meant to perhaps expand or renovate our airport or whatever that was going to be, come down because of people maybe not having the right information. So we must appreciate that this development is not just for the government, it's also for the communities. And because the private sector also wants to make money out of this, let's have a conversation. Let's create platforms where we can actually come up with workable solutions on how to develop this country together and not for the benefit of a few.
Interesting, because when Kenyans hear PPP, they think government wametuuza. They've sold something. They're selling our airport. They're selling our land. It's always very interesting. Now let's talk about government. What is the role of government institutions like the PPP Directorate in building public trust and facilitating transparent community engagement?
So I talked about the PPP regulatory framework, which comprises of the laws, the institutions, and also the processes. And one of the institutions is the Directorate of PPP. And the Directorate of PPP is basically like the advisor of government on matters PPPs. And it will be managing the entire process of, the PPP projects from conceptualization all the way to procurement, and even after construction, making sure that the project delivers on the intended objectives and coordinating with the contracting authorities. I talked about government agencies implementing the projects, and equally the PPP committee, which is on top of the PPP directorate, just making sure that the right information is channeled to the committee so that it can make the right decisions on these projects. Now, the directorate, of course, working together with the contracting authorities, has an important role to making sure that, information is disseminated to the public about this project. What are we talking about? What does it serve? How much are we talking to in terms of investment? What is the, contract period of these projects? So it's the directorate that will play a key role, of course, working together with the contracting authority to make sure that that information is available so that there is sort of public trust that, yes, this project is good for the community. They equally have a role to play in terms of building capacity. We just mentioned about the importance of creating awareness in the public and also making sure that the public officials that are handling these projects have the tools of trade in terms of skills and knowledge to evaluate and package these projects. So the directorate will be at the forefront of trying to make sure that this is achieved by the different units under the directorate. So it plays a critical role. It's not easy. There's a lot of work that needs to be done before these projects are ready. And the directorate will be at the cornerstone of making sure that this is done in line with the law, but equally in a manner that creates, that public trust.
What more do you think the government should do?
Trust building is a process. And I think in an era of, the fourth industrial revolution, towards the end of it, where everyone has access to information, you can't afford to be a referee who is relying solely on VAR. So what I have seen from government is actually reacting to things after they have come up. And I think for me, they need to play a more proactive role, as he has mentioned, in terms of sharing information beforehand, identifying which are the right channels, again, with the evolution that is happening with communication. I think identifying the right channels, of course, with a very targeted audience, depending on whatever the project is. So I think for me, that's very, very, very important, that giving the right information. And in an era where mis and disinformation is also quite high, I think the government needs to because their role is basically to create a neutral ground where private sector can come in and the public can also benefit. They also need, I think, to work better to define some of the incentives, for example, as we mentioned earlier, on people who are actually going out of their way to embed community engagement, empowerment. And then if you go back to some of the key principles of development that, of course, are the rules that govern development, is the human rights-based approach. So if you look at participation, linkage to rights, accountability, I think huge. Underline and strike through. I think for me, that has been one of the key issues with this framework. How do we define accountability and to who is it important? Non-discrimination. People just getting to understand, why is this project being done? I think, is it anchored to the Vision 2030? Why is it anchored to whatever transformation agenda? That communication is very important. And most importantly, I think that contributes to the T within the human rights-based approach, which is transparency. It does no harm to just give the right information, because if you don't, as we have seen it before, Kenyans have the skill sets, they have the know-how to actually get information. So it actually looks bad when you don't share information. People get information, they are sharing it on your behalf. And we have all the laws. Access to information is actually a constitutional right in this country. So I think government needs to play a better role in being proactive, especially now that we know that given the changing dynamics with fiscal or access to funds for development, that will be relying on private sector, so that we can overcome what you mentioned, that every time PPPs are mentioned, then the only thing that comes back to mind is colonialism as well. Slavery, for lack of a better word.
Really?
Yep. Maybe I can add perhaps from a different perspective. Of course, government has a role to create the right ecosystem in terms of the laws, the processes, but equally it has a role to play in making sure that these projects are bankable. Now, bankability is a buzzword that has been used and at times misused out there. When you're talking about developing markets, like Kenya, for example, whereby we have limitations and challenges in terms of the financial ecosystem. I hear other corners calling it architecture. There are quite a number of limitations because when you're looking at these kind of projects, most of them will be large scale, and those will require heavy investment coming from the private sector. Now, because of how the financial system is structured, I'll give you an example. The financial markets, for example, in Kenya, and I'm looking at the banking sector, might not be willing to advance financing on a longer term arrangement because of the risk, ecosystem around these projects, and because of the long term nature of the exposure, because of the nature of these infrastructure projects. And because of that, then it becomes difficult to get the right package of financing to channel to these projects. And that is why we say government can come in to bridge this gap and make it easier for lenders to advance financing at a longer terms that makes those projects, viable. And this is something that government must play now, especially in the first phases of implementation of PPP projects, so that we can build the maturity of the financial system. Because ultimately, PPP projects should be financed locally. I still emphasize on the need to make sure that we are the ones financing these projects, because offshore financing will come with many conditions and ultimately actually dilutes the savings that will have made on the cost of financing of these projects. So it's important that as government creates, that ecosystem, and I think I've written an article in your Business Daily that speaks to some solutions that government could attempt to make this a reality. Like, for example, merging some of the government banks to create an infrastructure bank for Kenya. And this bank will extend financial support mechanisms to these projects so that it's easier for private sector to come in and finance these projects. So government has a huge role and responsibility in making sure that PPP projects are successful. And it's not just the regulatory framework perspective, but equally looking at the financing, looking at the risk management framework. How do we allocate these risks? Can government perhaps shoulder more risks now because we are still in a new space, so that we can create that comfort from the private sectors to invest now, and then subsequently perhaps it can take a different approach because we'll have built that track record and foundation for these projects.
How do you envision the role of community engagement evolving for the next generation of PPPs?
I think it's good to set the context on why we think it's important to be in this conversation. Forum Civ, as a civil society organization, exists as an enabler, but also as an implementer. And what does that mean? Our vision is to create a just and sustainable world where all people have the power to effect change. So if we are to stick to that guideline and we see that development is no longer anchored under the natural principles of public finance, and now we have private sector in, then it becomes very important to also work with private sector to ensure that they also understand their responsibility beyond profits on how else they can work better with all the actors to stimulate development. So in terms of what I see the future and our role in it, I think it's a more people-driven PPP projects. And we are in the conversation on how do we ensure that there's a conducive environment for small-scale public-private partnership project, for example, because I think the current focus is on huge infrastructure projects that costs perhaps billions of dollars. But then how do we bring that down to actually where the change is. Remember, if we have to effect change, it has to be in those communities that require markets, communities that require health facilities. And as you mentioned about local financing, for instance, if you look at the recent report, Kenya, I think SACCOs raised close to 1.7 trillion Kenya shillings. How can we utilize that to develop our own communities, to develop our own markets, develop our own health facilities? We see the communities playing a critical role in initiating the PIPs, the privately initiated projects, actually coming from communities and going to county governments and providing these solutions. And I think that's the role we play. We have the methods, we have the tools. I think we have over 35 years of experience now showing that if you work with communities to define their own priorities and work with the experts like Johnson, work with the private sector to help them structure them as business models, which is, I think, the work that we are looking to work with the Miundo Misingi to develop and help communities understand that they can use PPPs as avenues to make changes in their communities. So that's the future we envision.
What are some of the examples of really successful community engagement projects that you have encountered, and why are they good examples?
That is a really tough question, because then coming up with like best is difficult. What I can say is I know quite a number of private sector-led development projects that are leading the way, ensuring how communities can be engaged better. We have, for example, some wind farm in Il Kajiado, where we've seen a deliberate effort to actually involve communities. I think there's also some effort that has been done in Olkaria to ensure that communities are put on board at the right time. But we still can do more, and we can do better by ensuring that these are not defined. You know, where you come into a space that decisions have been made. We feel like in PPPs, as the unionists say, communities are not on the table, they are on the menu. And when you're on the menu, then someone decides which piece they are going to have and which they are not. We want communities to be on the table.
That's a very interesting perspective.
We have been involved in quite a number of PPP projects across Africa, managing specific components. Unfortunately, we've not handled a whole transaction from end to end, but we are currently working on a project in Malawi, at the border of Malawi, Mozambique, Malawi, Tanzania, Malawi, and Zambia. And these are border markets. And these are markets that are supposed to serve communities, the women groups, and the youth, so that they have a decent place to come and sell their goods, and at the end of the day, make money out of it. Now, that's a project that we have effective influence on, and we've made sure that there is engagement at every point on the development of that project, so that ultimately, when the project is taken to the market, then it's able to meet, that intended need. And because of that, then we've devised ways as to how we can go beyond just what the PPP law of Malawi requires in terms of community engagement. I think that's to show that we can be creative in terms of how we structure the project, in terms of how we create a platform that allows the private sector to also innovatively raise financing for that particular project. But just also to highlight as to where I see this going, we talked about the financial challenges and limitations of Africa. I see quite a number of organizations that have come up with packages to address that challenge. So when you talk about sustainability funds or green funds or climate finance available in the market, these are pockets of funds that are targeting projects that can showcase, the impact to the communities, to the environment. And so projects will be forced to make sure that they embed climate and community engagement, environmental safeguards, so that they can access these pockets of finance that in most cases are priced way below what the market is offering. The terms and conditions are friendlier than what the market is offering. So going forward, we will see governments and across Africa being forced to make sure that they can structure projects to optimize, these benefits. And I think that's a good thing. Unfortunately, it's driven by the financing aspect. I'm hoping that going forward, we will do this just because we want to make sure that we improve in the lives of our people. So it will slowly happen, and it's good that it's already taking shape. And that is something that we are driving at the Miundo Misingi Hub.
It has been a wonderful discussion at the People's Partnership podcast, and I have been your host. My name is Rina Kimeu. If you're going to remember anything today, PPPs are not just about infrastructure. They're about people and how communities can engage with both private and government. Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep sharing the information you get from podcasts like this one.